The maître d' at Céleste didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. His particular brand of cruelty was polished, quiet, and delivered with a smile that never reached his eyes. And on a rainy Tuesday evening in Manhattan, he aimed every ounce of it directly at Claire Navarro. She had arrived at 7:14 p.m., 14 minutes early for her reservation, wearing a navy wrap dress she'd pressed twice that morning and the pearl earrings her mother had left her. Her dark hair was pinned back neatly. She carried no designer bag, just a small clutch in burgundy leather, slightly worn at the clasp. She had stood at the entrance of Céleste and felt for a moment the particular thrill of a place that seemed to exist slightly above the rest of the world. Céleste occupied the top floor of a midtown building made almost entirely of glass. Its walls looked out over the city like a crown looking down at everything beneath it. The tablecloths were the color of winter snow. The chandeliers were Italian, hand-blown, and had been featured in 2 separate architecture magazines. Every surface caught the light and threw it somewhere beautiful, and every member of the staff had been trained, deliberately and thoroughly, to recognize who belonged there and who did not. "Good evening," Claire said, approaching the host stand. "I have a reservation. Navarro, party of 2, 7:30. The maître d', a man whose name tag read Philip in clean serif font, glanced at his tablet. Then he glanced at her. Then, with the slow precision of someone performing a ritual, he glanced back at the tablet. "Navarro," he repeated. "Not a question. Thy verdict." That's right. Philip set the tablet down with the kind of deliberate care that communicated, wordlessly, that the conversation was already over. "I'm afraid I'm not seeing that reservation, ma'am." Claire blinked. "I made it last week. My assistant confirmed it yesterday morning." He tilted his head slightly. "I understand. Unfortunately, our system occasionally experiences discrepancies. We're fully committed this evening, and without a confirmed reservation in our records—" "I have the confirmation email," Claire said, already reaching for her phone. She pulled it up, subject line reading, "Céleste NYC, reservation, confirmed, Navarro, 7:30 p.m., and held the screen toward him. Philip looked at the phone the way a man looks at something he already knows he won't be changing his mind about. "I appreciate that, ma'am. However, our internal records don't reflect—" "Your internal records," Claire said, keeping her voice even, "don't reflect a reservation that exists. That seems like a problem with your records, not with mine." Something shifted behind Philip's eyes. Not shame. More like annoyance at the inconvenience of being contradicted. "Perhaps," he said, "if you'd like to wait at the bar, I can check with our reservations manager." "I'll wait," Claire said. She waited 22 minutes. She counted. The bar was beautiful, all dark wood and amber light, and the bartender was kind enough, offering her water and then a menu she didn't order from. Around her, couples were escorted past toward their tables. A man in a rumpled blazer and expensive sneakers was shown through without a second glance. A group of 4 in business casual were greeted warmly. Claire sat on her bar stool with her phone in her lap and her back straight and told herself that this was simply an administrative error, that it would be resolved, that she had every right to be sitting exactly where she was. At 7:36, Philip reappeared. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice had changed. It had moved from merely dismissive to something that was almost apologetic in its architecture, but completely empty of actual apology. "I've spoken with our reservations team. Unfortunately, the confirmation you received appears to have been sent in error. We don't have a table available this evening." Claire looked at him steadily. "You're telling me that a confirmation email from your restaurant was a mistake? It does happen. Technological errors, and there's no table. On a Tuesday evening, at 7:30. We're fully committed." She could see from where she sat at least 3 empty tables in the main dining room. One had a small reserved card on it. The others had nothing at all. "I see," Claire said. She picked up her clutch from the bar. She kept her voice perfectly calm, because she had learned a long time ago that composure was the most powerful thing a woman could carry in a room that didn't want her. "Thank you for your time." She walked out. The elevator doors closed behind her, and for a moment, just a moment, her shoulders dropped. She exhaled through her nose and pressed the lobby button and watched the floors count down and refused to let herself feel the sting of it more than she absolutely had to. Outside, the rain had picked up. She stood under the building's awning and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, are you already inside? I'm about 10 minutes away. The meeting ran over. I'm outside," she said. "They turned me away." A pause. "They what?" "The restaurant. They said the reservation was an error, said they were fully committed." She glanced back at the building's glass facade. "There were empty tables, Marcus." Another pause, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was quiet in the particular way that meant something was being carefully controlled. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm standing in the rain, but I'm fine." "Don't move," he said. "I'll be there in 10 minutes." She stayed under the awning. A cab splashed through a puddle at the curb. 2 women in heels ran past laughing, holding a tote bag over their heads. A doorman from a neighboring building offered her a small nod of solidarity she hadn't expected, and found, absurdly, nearly undid her more than anything else. Marcus arrived in 9 minutes. He was tall, lean, dressed simply in a dark coat and no tie, his dark hair slightly damp from running from the car. He found her immediately, and something crossed his face when he saw her standing there. Not pity, but something fiercer and quieter than pity. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. She told him. She was precise and calm, and she did not editorialize. She described Philip, the tablet, the 22-minute wait, the empty tables, the careful bureaucratic language of a dismissal designed to sound like a mistake. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said. "It's fine," Claire said. "Let's just find somewhere else." "It's not fine," Marcus said gently. "But we don't need to make a scene tonight." He looked up at the building. Something in his expression shifted, thoughtful, almost analytical. Like he was solving a problem. Like he was already somewhere else in his mind, working through something she couldn't see yet. "Marcus," she said, "what are you thinking?" He looked back at her and smiled. It was a small smile, but it reached his eyes, and it had something in it she recognized after 3 years of marriage, a particular quiet certainty that she had learned over time to find both reassuring and occasionally terrifying. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I'm hungry and I hate to see good glass wasted on people who don't deserve the view." Claire narrowed her eyes. "That doesn't tell me anything." "No," he agreed and held out his hand. "Let's get dinner. I'll tell you over food." She took his hand. They walked toward a cab stand at the end of the block. Above them, Céleste glittered against the wet Manhattan sky, completely indifferent. It had no idea what was coming. The restaurant they ended up in was 12 blocks south of Céleste and operated out of a narrow townhouse that had been converted sometime in the 70s and never fully decided what it wanted to be after that. The lighting was warm and slightly uneven. The menu was handwritten on a chalkboard. The owner, a heavy-set Greek man named Stavros, recognized Marcus the moment they walked in and immediately produced a corner table that hadn't been on the floor plan. "Mr. Navarro," Stavros said, gripping Marcus's hand with both of his. "We always have room." "Thank you, Stavros," Marcus said. "The lamb, if it's available. Always available for you." Claire sat across from her husband and watched him pour water into both their glasses with the same ease he brought to everything. Boardrooms, charity galas, difficult conversations, Greek restaurants in the middle of a rainy Tuesday. Marcus Navarro was not a man who performed comfort. He simply inhabited it, wherever he happened to be standing. This was something people misunderstood about him, she had noticed. They expected someone with his particular level of wealth to announce itself, to arrive with visible armor, the watch, the car, the practiced gravity of someone who knew their own net worth to the decimal. Marcus wore a decent watch. He drove himself when he could. His gravity was real, but it came from somewhere quieter than money. He had built Navarro Capital over 14 years, starting with a mid-sized logistics company he'd acquired out of near bankruptcy, and restructured so thoroughly that within 3 years it was generating margins that drew attention from people who paid professional attention to such things. He had a reputation in certain circles for being exceptionally patient and occasionally ruthless, not in the theatrical sense, but in the precise, surgical sense of someone who identified what needed to be removed and removed it without ceremony or announcement. Claire had met him at a fundraiser 6 years ago when she was working in development for a non-profit focused on literacy programs in underfunded schools. She had been explaining the organization's 5-year impact model to a donor who was only half listening, and Marcus had appeared at her elbow and asked a question so specific and informed that she'd turned around expecting someone else entirely. They'd spoken for 2 hours. He called the next morning. They were married 18 months later in a small ceremony in Vermont, with 30 people and too many wildflowers and rain that started exactly as they exchanged rings and stopped exactly as they kissed. She had kept her professional identity carefully separate from his. She consulted for non-profits now, independently. She used her maiden name professionally. She did not mention Marcus in meetings unless specifically asked, and even then she kept it brief. She was not hiding him. She was simply herself, and she had worked too long at being herself to allow anyone to reduce her to a footnote in someone else's biography. This was why. She understood. Philip at Céleste had looked at her the way he had. She had arrived without the markers, without the visible armor. And someone like Philip, trained to filter human beings through the sieve of visible wealth, had looked at a woman in a pressed navy dress with a worn burgundy clutch and made a calculation so fast he probably hadn't even been aware he was making it. "You're doing that thing," Marcus said. She looked up from her water glass. "What thing?" "Where you're processing something very calmly and very thoroughly, and the only sign is that you've been looking at the same spot on the table for 90 seconds. "I was thinking about Philip," she said. "The maître d'." "The maître d'." She set her glass down. "I want to understand something. People like that, they're not malicious exactly. They're just operating on a system of signals. Dress, bag, posture, manner of speaking. They're pattern matching. And when the pattern doesn't match what they expect, they default to exclusion." She paused. "It's almost impersonal." "It's not impersonal when you're the one standing in the rain," Marcus said. "No," she admitted. "It's not." The lamb arrived. Stavros hovered for a moment with the particular pride of a man who cooked to communicate something beyond mere sustenance, then retreated. They ate, and Claire felt some of the evening's tension begin to leave her shoulders, replaced by the specific warmth of good food and a husband who knew when to talk and when to simply be present. It was over the second glass of wine that Marcus said it. "I made a call on the way over." Claire looked at him. "To whom?" "Daniel Reyes." He said the name neutrally, the way he said most things. Daniel Reyes was his head of acquisitions, a compact, meticulous man who could assess a deal's fundamental viability in roughly the time it took most people to read a 1-page summary. "You called Daniel," Claire said slowly, "on the way to dinner." "I asked him to pull everything currently available on Céleste Group LLC. Marcus cut a piece of lamb with unhurried precision. "The restaurant is part of a small hospitality group, 3 properties in New York, 1 in Miami. The parent company has been carrying significant debt since a restructuring attempt 2 years ago that didn't go as planned. They brought in outside investors who imposed cost-cutting measures the management team then implemented badly. The Miami property is hemorrhaging. One of the New York properties, not Céleste itself, a smaller place in Tribeca, is already in default on its lease." Claire stared at him. "You knew all of this before dinner." "I knew some of it. I knew the group was distressed." Daniel confirmed the details. He looked up from his plate. "Céleste itself is actually the only healthy asset in the portfolio. Good margins, strong reputation, loyal clientele. The issue is that the parent company keeps drawing from it to support the failing properties." "Marcus," Claire said. She set her fork down. "What exactly did you do on the way to this restaurant?" He considered the question with the particular care he gave to questions that deserved it. "I instructed Daniel to begin a preliminary assessment of what an acquisition of the full Céleste Group portfolio would look like. The hospitality assets, the lease structures, the staff contracts." The room felt very still for a moment. Because they turned me away, Claire said. Because they have a distressed asset being mismanaged by people who don't understand what they actually own, Marcus said. And because a man named Philip decided, based on what you were carrying, that you didn't deserve a table. He picked up his wine glass. Both things are true at the same time. Claire was quiet for a long moment. She picked her fork back up. This is not a small undertaking. No, you can't buy a restaurant group because someone was rude to your wife. I'm not, Marcus said. I'm potentially acquiring a distressed hospitality portfolio at favorable terms because the fundamentals support it. The fact that it also addresses an injustice is what my college ethics professor would have called a secondary benefit. Despite herself, Claire laughed. It came out before she could stop it. A real laugh, surprised out of her. And Marcus smiled at it the way he always smiled at her laugh, like it was something he had been quietly waiting for. This is going to be complicated, she said. Most worthwhile things are. The staff, most of them had nothing to do with what happened. Correct, which is why any restructuring would be handled carefully. His voice was matter-of-fact. But she heard the thing beneath it, the assurance that she was already part of the calculation, that her instinct to protect the innocent bystanders had already been anticipated and built into whatever he was thinking. And Philip, she asked. Marcus set down his glass. Philip, he said thoughtfully, will have the opportunity to work in an organization with very different values than the ones he apparently internalized. He paused. Or he won't. That part remains to be seen. Claire looked at her husband across the candle-lit table in a Greek restaurant on a rainy Tuesday in Manhattan and felt the full specific weight of who he was, not his net worth, not his reputation in the rooms she never entered, but the thing underneath all of that. A man who moved quietly and completely, who did not make threats, who simply altered the landscape until the problem no longer existed in the same form. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Daniel is going to have a very long night, she said. Daniel, Marcus said, is paid extremely well for exactly this reason. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist. Inside Céleste, 14 floors above the wet street, Philip was escorting a table of 4 to a window seat, gesturing toward the Manhattan skyline with practiced grace, utterly unaware that the ground beneath him had already begun to shift. The due diligence took 11 days. Claire knew this not because Marcus reported to her with updates. He didn't, not in detail, but because she could track the shape of his attention by the small things, the way he was on his phone at 6 in the morning before he'd made coffee, the Tuesday he came home at 11 carrying a folder he set on his desk and didn't open again until the next day, as if he needed distance from it. The Thursday evening he sat across from her in the living room and asked, out of nowhere, what she thought made a restaurant worth returning to. The feeling that they were glad you came, she said, without looking up from her book. He wrote something in the margin of a page he was reading. She didn't ask what. On the 12th day, Daniel Reyes came to their apartment for dinner. This was not unusual. Daniel had eaten at their table a dozen times, but Claire noticed he arrived with a leather portfolio she'd never seen him carry socially before, and that he and Marcus spent 40 minutes in the study before joining her in the dining room with the particular ease of 2 men who had just reached an agreement on something significant. Over pasta, Daniel turned to her with a directness she had always appreciated in him. Mrs. Navarro, he said, I want you to know that what happened to you at Céleste was what initiated this review, but what's justified the full acquisition is the numbers. This is a sound investment. Marcus didn't let sentiment drive the decision. I know, Claire said. I'm telling you, because some people, when they find out, will say otherwise. Some people always say otherwise about something, Claire said. The pasta is getting cold. Daniel smiled and picked up his fork. The acquisition was structured in 2 phases. Navarro Capital would first acquire the debt held by Céleste Group's outside investors, 3 separate entities, who Daniel had discovered were collectively exhausted by the underperformance of the Miami property and the Tribeca lease default, and were privately eager to exit at a discount simply to close the exposure on their books. Acquiring the debt gave Navarro effective leverage over the entire group without a single public announcement. The second phase, the formal acquisition of the operating company itself, would follow within 30 to 60 days, depending on the cooperation of the existing management team. It was clean, it was quiet, and it was, Claire reflected, very Marcus. What she had not anticipated was Eleanor Voss. Eleanor was the founder of Céleste Group, not the current management team, not the outside investors who had driven it toward distress, but the original architect of the restaurant itself. She was 63 years old, sharp-featured, silver-haired, and had built Céleste from a single 40-seat dining room on the Upper East Side into the glass-walled Manhattan landmark it had become over 20 years. She had sold her majority stake 8 years ago to fund her retirement and her daughter's medical treatment, a fact Claire discovered not through Marcus or Daniel, but through a profile piece she found while reading about the restaurant's history on a quiet Saturday morning. She read the profile twice. Then she sat with it for a long moment, looking out the window at the city. Eleanor Voss had built something extraordinary, and then watched from a distance as the people who bought it slowly mismanaged the thing she had made. The profile was 3 years old. In it, Eleanor said, carefully and with visible restraint, that she hoped the group's new direction would honor what Céleste had originally stood for. Claire put her phone down and went to find Marcus. He was in the kitchen. She handed him her phone with the profile pulled up. He read it standing at the counter, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was rearranging something internally. Not a visible change exactly, more like a slight deepening of focus. "You're going to want to meet her," Claire said. "Yes," he said. He handed the phone back. "I already have a call with her tomorrow morning." Claire blinked. "You already found her." "Daniel did. She's been living in Connecticut. She's aware the group is in trouble." He paused. "She reached out to us, actually. She heard through someone in the investment community that Navarro Capital was circling the debt. She called Daniel directly." "What did she say?" Marcus looked at her steadily. "She said she didn't care who bought it, as long as they understood what it was supposed to be." Something moved through Claire's chest. "And what did Daniel say?" "He told her to call back tomorrow and talk to me." The call lasted 2 hours. Claire was not on it. She had a client meeting of her own. But Marcus told her about it that evening while they were making dinner together, standing side by side at the kitchen island. Him chopping vegetables with the focused economy he brought to physical tasks, while she managed the stove. Eleanor Voss, it turned out, had very specific ideas about what had gone wrong. The outside investors had pushed Céleste toward a model that prioritized visible exclusivity over genuine hospitality. They had trained the staff, deliberately, she emphasized, to perform a kind of social filtration, to assess guests not by their behavior, but by their appearance. The Maître d' program, she called it, with barely concealed bitterness. Philip had not invented his behavior. He had been trained into it by a management philosophy that believed exclusion created desirability. She knew about the way guests were being treated, Claire asked. She suspected. She'd heard things from former staff. Marcus set down the knife. "When I told her what happened to you, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, and I'm quoting, 'That is exactly the thing I spent 20 years trying to make impossible in that room.'" Claire was quiet, stirring something on the stove that didn't need stirring. "She wants to come back," Marcus said. "Not as an owner, as a consultant. She wants to be part of rebuilding what it was supposed to be." "What did you say?" "I said I'd discuss it with my wife." She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the calm, open expression he wore when he was genuinely waiting. Not performing patience, but actually completely present and curious about what she would say. This was the moment she felt the full shape of what was happening, not just an acquisition, not just a correction of a Tuesday evening's humiliation. Something larger was being assembled, a restoration of something that had been taken apart badly by people who hadn't understood its value. "Yes," Claire said. "She should come back." Marcus nodded once, as if this had already been the answer in his mind, and he had simply needed to hear it confirmed by the person whose instincts he trusted most in the world. The acquisition closed 17 days later. There was no press release. No announcement. The legal documentation was filed in the ordinary way of such things, processed through the relevant offices, recorded in the relevant systems. Céleste Group LLC passed quietly and completely into the portfolio of Navarro Capital. The existing management team was notified by letter. The outside investors had already exited. The operating staff received a communication informing them that a change of ownership had occurred and that their contracts would be honored in full while a review of the organization's direction was conducted. Philip received the same letter as everyone else. What no one outside of a very small circle knew yet, not Philip, not the dining public, not the food press that covered Céleste's every seasonal menu change, was what was coming next. Claire knew, Eleanor Voss knew, Daniel Reyes knew, and had already begun coordinating the logistics with the quiet efficiency that made him indispensable. And Marcus Navarro, sitting at his desk on a Thursday evening, reading through staff performance reviews with the same attention he brought to quarterly earnings reports, knew exactly what the first morning of new management was going to look like. He had already sent one specific instruction ahead. Claire's name was to be added to the reservation system. Permanent standing, any evening, any time. It was, he had told Daniel when issuing it, not a gesture. It was a correction of the record. The evening Marcus chose was a Friday, 3 weeks after the acquisition closed. He didn't tell Claire where they were going. He told her only to wear something she liked, not something appropriate, not something suitable, but something she actually liked, and to be ready at 7. She stood in front of her closet for a few minutes, and then reached past the safe choices toward the back, where a dress in deep burgundy silk had been hanging since a trip to Florence 2 years ago. She had bought it on impulse on a narrow street near the Arno and worn it exactly once, to a dinner she'd felt slightly too self-conscious at to enjoy it properly. She put it on. She wore her mother's pearl earrings. She left the burgundy clutch at home and carried instead a small black bag she'd had for years because she had decided, quietly and firmly, that she was not dressing for anyone's system of signals tonight. She was dressing for herself. Marcus was waiting in the living room when she came down. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the one that had nothing performative in it, the one that was simply and completely real. "Perfect," he said. "Where are we going?" she asked. "You'll see." The car moved uptown through Friday evening traffic, the city doing what it always did on Friday evenings, exhaling, loosening, the week's accumulated tension releasing into something that felt almost like permission. Claire watched the streets pass and felt a low, quiet anticipation building in her chest that she couldn't entirely account for. Marcus sat beside her, one hand resting near hers, not speaking. He had the stillness of someone who knew exactly what was waiting and was content to let it arrive in its own time. When the car stopped and she looked up at the building, she understood. The glass facade of Céleste caught the last of the evening light and scattered it in every direction. The entrance, which she had stood outside of in the rain 4 weeks ago, was warmly lit, the awning extending over a small queue of arriving guests. Nothing about it looked different from the outside, but Claire noticed as they walked toward the entrance that the small printed sign beside the door, which had previously read Céleste in its spare, self-important font, had been replaced. The new sign read Céleste, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Est, 1998, restored 2024. A place for everyone who belongs here, which is everyone. She stopped walking. "Eleanor's idea," Marcus said beside her. The last 4 words were hers. Claire looked at the sign for a long moment. Then she walked through the door. The interior was the same in its bones, the Italian chandeliers, the snow-white tablecloths, the glass walls opening onto the city, but something in the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was difficult to name precisely and immediately recognizable nonetheless. The room felt, for lack of a more technical term, warmer. Not literally. The temperature was fine, but in the sense that the light seemed to fall differently. The spacing between tables had been subtly increased. The music was present, but not asserting itself. The staff moved through the room with the particular grace of people who were genuinely glad to be doing what they were doing. A woman approached them from the host stand. She was perhaps 30, with close-cropped natural hair and a smile that arrived before she spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Navarro," she said warmly. "Welcome to Céleste. We're so glad you're here." Not, "I see your reservation." Not right this way. "We're so glad you're here." Claire registered the difference immediately, and felt it somewhere specific and unguarded. "Thank you," she said. They were shown to a corner table near the window. Not the best table in the room in the conventional sense, but positioned so that the city spread out in two directions, the evening skyline throwing its familiar geometry of light against the dark sky. Claire sat down and looked out at Manhattan and felt the strange layered quality of the moment, the same view she had been denied a month ago, now simply, quietly hers. Eleanor Voss appeared 10 minutes later. She was smaller in person than Claire had imagined from the profile photo, compact and precise in a dark jacket, silver hair cut short, eyes that assessed a room the way a musician assesses a concert hall, listening for its acoustics before a note is played. She came to their table and shook Marcus's hand with the directness of someone who had long ago stopped performing deference to anyone, and then turned to Claire. "Mrs. Navarro," she said, "I owe you an apology on behalf of something I built and lost control of." "You don't," Claire said. "You weren't there." "No," Eleanor said, "but it was my foundation they built that behavior on, the exclusivity model. I resisted it for years, and then I wasn't there to keep resisting it. That matters." She paused. "What happened to you should never have been possible in this room." Claire looked at this woman who had spent 20 years building something, and then watched it be slowly corrupted by people who mistook cruelty for sophistication, and felt a recognition that moved through her like a current. "Sit down," Claire said. "Have dinner with us." Eleanor looked briefly surprised. Then she sat. The three of them ate together for 2.5 hours. Eleanor talked about the early years of Céleste, the 40-seat room, the handwritten menus, the philosophy she had carried from her grandmother's kitchen in Lyon, which was simply that a table was a place of equality, that the act of sharing food was the oldest form of human recognition, and that anyone who used a dining room to make another person feel lesser had fundamentally misunderstood what a dining room was for. She was funny and sharp, and occasionally said something so precise about the hospitality industry that Marcus quietly noted it on his phone. Midway through the meal, Claire asked the question she had been holding since the beginning. What happened to Philip? Eleanor and Marcus exchanged a brief look. He was offered a position, Marcus said, in a different role, not front of house. He took it? He did. Marcus turned his wineglass slightly. He also apparently wrote a letter. Claire raised her eyebrows. To whom? To you, Marcus said. He reached into his jacket pocket and set an envelope on the table beside her plate. Her name was written on the front in careful, deliberate handwriting, Mrs. Navarro, with no other address, no flourish, nothing performative about it. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter was a single page, handwritten, and it was not what she had expected. It was not defensive, it was not elaborate. It was the letter of a man who had been made to look clearly at something he had been doing without fully examining it. The system he had been operating inside, the ease with which it had become habit, the specific evening 4 weeks ago that had apparently stayed with him in a way he hadn't anticipated. I told myself, he had written near the middle of the page, that I was reading the room. I understand now that I was doing something much smaller than that. I was reading a dress and a bag and deciding a person. I don't expect you to forgive that. I'm not sure I've forgiven it in myself yet. But I wanted you to know that I am aware of it now, which I wasn't before, and that awareness is because of you. Claire folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. She set it beside her plate and looked out at the city for a moment, the skyline holding its familiar positions against the dark. He'll be all right, she said, and she meant it. Eleanor reached across and refilled Claire's wineglass without asking, the way someone does when they have decided you are already family. What I want to know, she said, is what you think of the risotto, because I changed the recipe from what they'd been serving, and I need an honest opinion. It was extraordinary, Claire said. Good, because the previous version had cream in it, which is an act I can only describe as violence against northern Italian cuisine. She said it with such settled conviction that both Claire and Marcus laughed, and the laughter moved through the room and disappeared into the warm air of the restaurant, easy and unannounced. Later, after Eleanor had excused herself to speak with the kitchen, and the dessert had been cleared, and the city had settled into its later Friday self outside the glass walls, Marcus and Claire sat together in the particular quiet of two people who had been in each other's company long enough that silence between them was its own kind of conversation. "That sign," Claire said finally, "outside. Yes, a place for everyone who belongs here, which is everyone." She looked at him. "You approved that." "Eleanor proposed it. I approved it immediately." He paused. It seemed correct. Claire looked out at the city. 14 floors below, the street was alive with the ordinary Friday evening movement of 1 million people, going about the uncelebrated business of their lives, heading home, heading out, passing each other without ceremony or acknowledgement, belonging to the city the way everyone belongs to a city, which is simply by being in it. 4 weeks ago, she had stood on that street in the rain with a confirmation email on her phone and been told, in the polished, quiet language of exclusion, that she didn't belong in the room above it. The room was hers now. Not because of the acquisition, Marcus had been right that the investment stood on its own terms, but in the older, more fundamental sense. The sense her grandmother's kitchen in rural Pennsylvania had operated on, the same sense Eleanor Voss's grandmother's kitchen in Lyon had operated on. A table is a place of recognition. You come to it, and you are seen. That is what a table is for. She picked up her wine glass. "To Eleanor," she said. Marcus raised his. "To Eleanor." They touched glasses. The sound was clean and bright, like something beginning. Outside, Manhattan held its impossible, indifferent, magnificent light against the sky, the same as it always had, the same as it would long after every restaurant and acquisition, and small human cruelty and small human correction had been absorbed into its vast and continuous story. But inside Céleste, on a Friday evening in a room made of glass and warmth and the smell of good food, Claire Navarro sat at her table and felt, with quiet and complete certainty, that she was exactly where she belonged. Which, after all, was the only place any of us are ever really trying to get to.